Coming up next, BookTV presents Afterwards, an hour-long discussion with the author of a new book. This week, author and journalist Mark Perry argues that it's necessary for the U.S. government to verbally engage with groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, even though they're considered to be terrorist organizations. He says we've done so in the past and that it's led to positive outcomes. Mark Perry is interviewed by terrorism analyst Larry Johnson, former deputy director in the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism. Mr. Johnson is the founder and main author of the No Quarter weblog.
Hello, I'm Larry Johnson. I'm a former employee of the Central Intelligence Agency. I also worked with the Department of State in counterterrorism. And I've been considered somewhat of an expert on terrorism because I can spell it. But today we have the opportunity for the ultimate reader's fantasy in this program afterwards to meet with an author. After you've read the book, I think all of you in the audience would have wanted to sit down and have a chance to say, I'd like to ask him some questions. So today, Mark Perry, glad to have this opportunity to speak with you about your book.
Larry, good to be here.
Talking to Terrorists. So let me ask you, what are you?
The first question I see is the hardest question. I'm a historian and author in one life and kind of a Middle East activist and analyst in another life. And this book, Talking to Terrorists, is a good combination of both because it refers to the history of the region and our diplomacy in the region while giving readers, I think, an insight into what's going on there and what the strategy is for the United States in dealing with the real challenge of terrorism in the region.
How did you get into becoming, what part of your bio is that you're written on military, written on intelligence, written on now terrorism? How did you make that transition? Did you, come out of college saying, I'm going to be a military intelligence terrorist analyst?
I came out of college thinking I was going to be Ernest Hemingway, and that never worked.
How's that working out? Well, I don't know. You've written several books.
I've written several. I didn't become Ernest Hemingway, and I became a journalist. In 1988, May of '88, I went to the West Bank as a stringer for a number of publications to report on the first Intifada. And I realized I couldn't report on it. I just was too politically involved in it. Began meeting Israelis and Palestinians, went to Tunis, was a guest at Mr. Arafat's office and got to meet him, and over the next 20 years worked with him on and off. And then during the second Intifada, I worked very hard in the West Bank to try to shape a number of unilateral ceasefires. Didn't work. 3 of them fell apart. Very tough time, very bloody. Saw some of that. And after Mr. Arafat's death, I decided that I would continue. I went out to meet Hamas and Hezbollah to try to shape an understanding of what I call political Islam and using them, the great middle ground of the Muslim world, of political Islam, the moderates, the Gironde,
right,
to kind of open up the region and to provide a way of shaping an American policy that makes sense.
So why did you decide to spend so much time in the Middle East and Israel in particular? Because it looks like you've been to Israel, more than
30 times.
30 times.
30 times. Well, you know what this is like. You go to a region, you fall in love with it. You just can't. The people are interesting. The politics are enormously complex. In fact, I try to keep from going to other parts of the world because I went to Vietnam a couple times and I thought if I come here much more, I'm just going to fall in love with this part of the world and then I'm in real trouble. The Middle East is an attractive place. It's politics are very real there. They're very immediate every single day, and it pulls you in, and it pulled me in. It's pulled in thousands and thousands of Americans. I'm just one of them. It's a place worth getting to know, and I think the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular is the most difficult, complex, deeply seated, rooted conflict right now in the world. If we can solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we can solve anything. That's how deep it goes.
When you talk about talking to terrorists, obviously you are raising a touchy subject in America today. In fact, someone a few years ago that may have started this interview off by saying, Mark, why do you hate America?
Yes, it is, you're exactly right. It's a very touchy subject. It's painful for many people. And that's understandable. We all remember 9/11, and it's hard to get past 9/11. I'm not talking about talking to Al-Qaeda. I'm not talking about talking to dead-enders, Jacobins, revolutionaries, people who want to burn it down. Al-Qaeda doesn't have a constituency. They're just a revolutionary network. The people I'm talking about talking to are Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Muslim Brotherhood, the three most powerful, influential organizations and movements in the Middle East, the great middle ground of Islam that we should recruit to our side in the war on terrorism, not Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda deserves one outcome, and that's to be defeated and to be tracked down wherever they are and to be eliminated. I believe that firmly. But with the other groups, it's not the case. They can be our allies, and they should be.
I think, you know, the initial title of your book and approach probably tracks with what I would call the popular perception, which is we don't talk to terrorists. But the reality has been over the years, the U.S. policy was never we don't talk to terrorists. It was we make no concessions. We can negotiate, but no concessions. Now, that gets to a more interesting issue of if you're going to talk and not make concessions,
what's the point?
What is that?
Yeah, what's the point? You're exactly right. We have always talked to terrorists, or at least listened. The African National Congress, the PLO. You can go down the list of the organizations that, after a period of time and painful reflection on our part and on theirs, we've actually sat down to compare notes and to see how we could cooperate. It hasn't always been easy. I suppose the book's title should be Listening to Terrorists, because we talk at them all the time. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to disarm, you have to recognize Israel, you have to agree to all prior agreements, you have to give up violence, or we're not going to talk to you. Those kinds of demands, the same kinds of demands we made on the African National Congress and the PLO, never work.
So, you know, essentially, you're not the Dr. Doolittle of counterterrorism. You know, it's not talk to the terrorists, but it is, you're raising that instead of this policy that is inflexible, that says we're going to treat all terrorism as one variety and one type, you're suggesting that there's some nuances there.
There are, and I'm not suggesting that all talk yields real benefits. In the case of Hezbollah, which I talk about in my book, I was just in Beirut 4 weeks ago, and I was talking to the Minister of External Relations of Hezbollah, and I said, would it be worth talking to the United States? And he said, well, what's to talk about? and I did what you did. I kind of laughed, and I said, well, it's a good point. He said, listen, there's a lot of baggage here. We have to build a lot of bridges before we can sit down and talk. Maybe at some future point, when we build those bridges, we can do it. Right now might not be the best time. Maybe we don't have too much to say to each other. Well, that's not the case in Hamas. Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, said, we'd love to talk to the Americans. We'd love to be part of a peace process. We'd like to come to an understanding with the United States. We're not an enemy of the United States. We don't target or kill Americans. That would be Al-Qaeda. So there are nuances between these groups. Muslim Brotherhood is very different. We do talk to their parliamentarians in Egypt, and we have. So there are gradations, and we have to be sophisticated and nuanced in our approach.
Well, there's one thing I think that's missing in your book. This is not a criticism, but I'd be curious why you didn't include it, and you may have had another reason. Israel has a record of negotiating with terrorists.
Yes.
Repeatedly.
Yes.
Doing, and in fact, making concessions to terrorists in terms of trading prisoners, etc. So, and yet, you know, in America, we sit there, we always hold Israel up as the ultimate counterterrorism force to be emulated, when in fact, they've made more concessions and negotiations to terrorists over time than any other country I've followed. I don't know if you'd agree or disagree with that.
No, I'd agree, and you point out not a mistake in the book, but something that I shied away from. And I didn't say, you know, Israel does it, why can't we? Because then it seems to imply that if Israel does it, it's okay if we do it. We have to have an independent foreign policy. We have to decide what's in our interests apart from Israel. It could be that they'll coincide. But you're right. I mean, I was recently in Nablus, and I was talking to a member of Hamas, and he had been arrested for being a member of Hamas.